They called it a quiet auction because no one was supposed to cry out. I should have screamed. I should have fought. I should have run the moment I saw the stage being erected in the center of our pack's great hall. Its worn wooden planks scarred by generations of ceremonies that meant something beautiful. Matings, namings, the first hunt celebrations. Instead, it would witness my degradation. But I didn't run. I couldn't. Where does an Omega go when her own alpha has decided she's worth more as currency than as pack? The morning it happened, Frost painted delicate patterns on my bedroom window, and I traced them with my fingertip, thinking how beautiful they were. How naive I was to find beauty in ice when winter had already claimed so much from us. I should have seen the metaphor, how something so lovely could also be so cold, so final. Alpha Sterling had called an assembly for noon. Nothing unusual in that. Winter assemblies were tradition, a time to discuss rationing, to plan for the harsh months ahead, to remind us all that survival required sacrifice. I braided my dark hair with the same care I always did, pinned it back from my face, and wore the simple gray dress that marked my rank. Omega. The lowest. The expendable. I took my place in the back row, as was expected, settling between old Martha, whose arthritis made her movements slow and careful, and young Thomas, barely 18 and still uncertain of his place in our hierarchy. The familiar comfort of routine wrapped around me like a worn blanket. Sterling stood at the front, his presence commanding as always, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his alpha authority radiating from every inch of his tall frame. Behind him, rolled maps covered the wall, maps I recognized as our ancestral hunting grounds, the secret spaces our pack had roamed for 3 centuries, the lands we'd lost to developers 2 winters ago. My pack, he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. Winter approaches, and with it, hard choices. A murmur ran through the gathering. Hard choices. We all knew what that meant. Less food, smaller territories, the gradual erosion of everything our ancestors had built. The Holloway Development Group has made us an offer, Sterling continued, and my heart began to race. The developers, the ones who'd stolen our hunting grounds, turned sacred forest into strip malls and parking lots. They're willing to sell back the Northern Territory, our ancestral lands, for the right price. Hope flickered through the room like candlelight. Our hunting grounds back, the places where our great-grandparents had run, where the old songs still echoed in the wind. It would mean survival, prosperity, the restoration of our honor. The price, Sterling said, and his eyes found mine across the crowded room, requires sacrifice from us all. That should have been my warning. The way his gaze lingered on me, heavy with something that wasn't quite guilt, but wasn't quite resolve either. The way other pack members began to shift in their seats, some refusing to meet my eyes, others staring with a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. "We will hold an auction," he announced, and the words hit me like physical blows. 3 of our unmated Omegas will be offered to neighboring packs, and the proceeds will fund the land purchase. The world tilted. My ears rang. Around me, voices rose in murmurs and whispers, but I couldn't make out individual words. It was like being underwater, everything muffled and distant and wrong. 3 unmated Omegas. I looked around frantically. Sarah, barely 17, her face pale with terror. Janet, 22, who'd been caring for her sick mother for the past year. And me, 24, unremarkable, expendable. "The auction will take place tonight," Sterling continued, his voice steady as if he were discussing the weather, not selling pack members like livestock. "I expect all pack members to attend, to show our unity in this difficult decision." Unity, as if watching our own be sold would somehow bring us together. I wanted to stand up, to scream, to demand how he could do this to us. We were pack, we were family. You don't sell family. But my voice was trapped in my throat, my body frozen in shock and betrayal. The meeting continued, but I didn't hear another word. I sat there staring at my hands folded in my lap, watching them shake.
When it finally ended, when pack members began to file out, some casting apologetic glances my way, others carefully avoiding my gaze entirely, I remained seated. Nora. Martha's weathered hand touched my shoulder. "Child, I'm so sorry."
I looked up at her, this woman who'd helped deliver me, who taught me to braid my hair, who'd held me when my parents died in that car accident 10 years ago. Her eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "How can he do this?" I whispered. "How can he sell us?" Martha's face crumpled. "The pack is dying, sweetheart. We've lost too much. He thinks this is the only way. There has to be another way. If there was, don't you think he would have found it?" But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe it either. There were always other ways. Harder ways, perhaps, but ways that didn't require sacrificing the most vulnerable among us. I spent the rest of the day in my small cabin, the one I'd inherited from my parents, trying to pack a lifetime into a single suitcase. What do you take when you don't know where you're going, when you don't know who's going to own you by tomorrow? I folded the quilt my mother had made, her careful stitches spelling out love in every thread. I packed the leather journal where I'd been trying to write down our pack's oral histories before they were lost forever, the silver locket that held pictures of my parents, the few books that had meant something to me. Everything else, furniture my father had built, dishes my mother had collected, the life I'd carefully constructed in the shadow of grief, would stay behind. Someone else would live here, sleep in my bed, forget that I'd ever existed. As evening approached, I dressed carefully. Not because I wanted to look appealing to potential bidders, the thought made my stomach revolt, but because I refused to be broken down completely. I wore my best dress, deep blue like twilight, and let my hair fall loose around my shoulders. If I was going to be sold, I would at least maintain what dignity I could. The great hall had been transformed. The warm, familiar space where I'd attended countless pack gatherings now looked cold and commercial. A stage dominated the center, spotlights harsh against the wooden platform. Chairs arranged in rows, filled with faces I didn't recognize. Alphas from other packs come to browse the merchandise. I wanted to vomit. Sterling found me near the back entrance, where I'd been lingering, hoping against hope for a last-minute reprieve. "Nora," he said, and his voice was gentler than I had expected. "I want you to know this isn't personal. You're a good pack member, loyal, hardworking." "Just not worth keeping," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. He flinched. "The pack will survive without me, I understand." And I did, in the cold, logical part of my mind. 3 Omegas sold to buy back ancestral hunting grounds that could feed dozens. The math was simple, even if it was brutal. Just promise me you'll remember us. When you're running those lands again, remember what they cost. Sterling nodded, his jaw tight. "I will." It was a small comfort, but it was something. The auction began promptly at 8. I watched from the wings as Sarah was led to the stage first, her face pale but determined. She held herself with remarkable dignity as Sterling read her qualifications. Young, healthy, from good bloodlines, trained in traditional domestic skills. The bidding was swift and impersonal, paddles rising and falling like a deadly dance. She went to Alpha Morrison of the Eastern Ridge Pack for $12,000. Janet followed. Her bidding was lower. The pack members knew about her mother's illness, saw her as potentially divided in her loyalties. $8,000 to Alpha Crawford of the Southern Valley Pack. Then it was my turn. My legs felt like water as I walked to the center of the stage. The lights were too bright, making it impossible to see the faces in the audience clearly. They were just shapes, shadows, potential owners evaluating their purchase. "Lot number 3, Sterling announced, his voice carrying through the microphone. "Nora Winters, 24 years old, Omega, educated, literate, experienced in pack management and record keeping. No known health issues, no previous bonds." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of my own life being reduced to bullet points. When I opened them again, I focused on a spot on the back wall, refusing to look at the paddles that were beginning to rise. Bidding starts at $5,000. Paddles went up immediately. I tried not to count them, tried not to calculate my own worth in dollars and cents. $7,000, $8,000,
Do I hear 9? The numbers climbed. 10,000, 12, 15. I was apparently more valuable than I had realized, though I couldn't decide if that was insulting or flattering.
20,000, called a voice from the middle of the room, and the other bidders hesitated. It was a significant jump, one that made several paddles lower. 22,000, countered another voice. 25. The bidding slowed, then stopped. I could hear Sterling trying to encourage higher offers, but 25,000 seemed to be the ceiling for damaged goods like me. Going once, going twice, 30,000. The voice came from the back of the room, quiet but carrying easily through the sudden silence. I turned, squinting against the lights, trying to see who had just bought me. He was standing in the last row, partially hidden in shadow, tall, broad-shouldered, with snow dusting his dark coat as if he'd just walked in from outside. When he stepped forward into the light, I caught my breath. He was beautiful, in the way that dangerous things often are. Sharp cheekbones, silver eyes that seemed to catch and hold light, skin pale as winter morning. His hair was dark, almost black, and he moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with his own power. 30,000, going once. No other paddles rose. 30,000 was more money than most pack members saw in a year. Going twice. I found myself holding my breath, staring at this stranger who had just purchased me. His silver eyes met mine across the room, and something passed between us. Not attraction exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw something in me that others had missed. Sold to Alpha Lucien Frost of the Northern Reach. Lucien Frost. I'd heard the name whispered in pack stories, always with a mixture of respect and fear. The reclusive Alpha who controlled the northernmost territories, whose pack was rumored to be more legend than reality. Some said he was half wild himself, more wolf than man. Others claimed he could speak to the wind and call down snow with his voice. Looking at him now, I could believe the legends. The formalities took another hour. Contracts signed, money exchanged, ownership transferred. I stood to one side, trying to process the surreal nature of watching my own sale being finalized. Alpha Frost, Lucien, spoke quietly with Sterling, their voices too low for me to hear, but I caught fragments. Good care, safe passage, pack traditions. When it was over, when all the papers were signed and all the money counted, Lucien approached me. Up close, he was even more striking and more intimidating. He stood at least 6 feet tall, his presence commanding in a way that made my wolf instincts want to submit automatically. In his hands, he held a length of silver chain, delicate but strong, the traditional symbol of a purchased bond. My new leash. I tilted my chin up, meeting his eyes despite every instinct telling me to look down. If I was going to be owned, I would at least face it with dignity. Your name, he said quietly, is Nora? Yes. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell winter on his skin, pine and snow and something wild. I'm sorry they made you a price, he said, his voice so low only I could hear. I only want to make you a promise. Before I could ask what he meant, he was fastening the chain around my wrist. Not tight, not painful, but unmistakably there, a symbol of my new status. What promise? I whispered. His silver eyes held mine. That you'll never be sold again. It wasn't much, a promise from a stranger who now owned me, but it was more than anyone else had offered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We leave tonight, he said. The journey to my territory is long, and winter storms are coming. I looked around the hall, at the pack members who were carefully not looking at me, at Sterling, who was already counting his money, at the familiar walls that had sheltered me my entire life. This was goodbye then, final and absolute. I need to get my things, I said. Of course, I'll wait. The walk back to my cabin was surreal, like moving through a dream. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt real. This morning, I'd been Nora Winters of the Winters Hollow Pack. Tonight, I was merchandise, sold and packaged for transport. I shouldered my small suitcase and took one last look around. My parents smiled at me from their wedding photo on the mantelpiece, frozen in a moment of happiness that felt like another lifetime. I touched the frame gently. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't stay and keep your memory alive here." But maybe I could carry it with me instead. Maybe memory wasn't about place, but about the love that created it. When I returned to the hall, most of the crowd had dispersed. Lucien stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with a woman I didn't recognize. Another member of his pack, perhaps. She had the same pale coloring, the same winter-touched beauty, but her eyes were warmer, more human. "Ready?" he asked when he saw me. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for this. The woman stepped forward. "I'm Vera," she said kindly, "Lucien's beta. I'll be traveling with you if that makes you more comfortable." It did, actually. The thought of being alone with my new owner, Alpha, whatever he was to me now, had been terrifying. "Thank you," I said. We walked out into the night together, leaving the warmth and light of the great hall behind. Snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes that caught in my hair and melted on my skin. A black SUV waited in the parking area, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. I paused at the passenger door, looking back at Winters Hollow one last time. The buildings were already becoming indistinct in the falling snow, familiar shapes blurring into memory. "It's hard," Vera said gently, "leaving everything you know." "Yes," I admitted. "It is. But sometimes," Lucien added, his voice carrying an odd note of understanding, "leaving is the only way to find where you really belong." I wondered if he was speaking from experience. The drive north was long and quiet. I sat in the back seat, watching the landscape change outside my window as we left everything familiar behind. The rolling hills of Winters Hollow gave way to denser forests, then to terrain that became increasingly wild and desolate. Snow fell more heavily the farther north we traveled, until the world outside was nothing but white and black, snow-covered trees reaching toward a starless sky. Vera dozed in the front passenger seat, but Lucien remained alert, his silver eyes focused on the road ahead. Occasionally, I caught him glancing at me in the rearview mirror, but he didn't try to make conversation. I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, what was happening, what would happen next. Instead, I lost myself in memories. Running through the forests around Winters Hollow as a child, my parents teaching me to read the signs in nature, which plants were edible, which tracks belonged to which animals, how to find water in drought and shelter in storms. The skills that had once seemed like games, preparation for a life I'd thought I'd live forever. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke to find the car had stopped. Outside, dawn was breaking over a landscape unlike anything I'd ever seen. We were parked in front of what looked like a hunting lodge, but larger, more complex. Log and stone construction that seemed to grow out of the forest itself, as if it had always been there. Smoke rose from several chimneys and warm light glowed in the windows. "Welcome to the Northern Reach," Lucien said quietly. I stepped out of the car, and the cold hit me like a physical blow. The air was thin and sharp, carrying scents of pine and snow, and something else, something wild and clean that I'd never smelled before. When I breathed in, it felt like drinking ice water. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. There was something about this place that spoke to a part of me I'd forgotten existed, the part that belonged to the wild, to the old ways, to the songs our ancestors had sung when the world was younger. "It's home," Vera said, appearing at my side with my suitcase. "Come, let's get you settled, and then you can meet everyone." The inside of the lodge was as impressive as the outside. Soaring ceilings supported by massive timber beams, stone fireplaces that could warm entire rooms, furniture that looked handcrafted from local wood. It was rustic but elegant, comfortable but clearly designed for a pack much larger than the three of us. "Where is everyone?" I asked, looking around at the empty great room. Lucien and Vera exchanged a glance, something passing between them that I couldn't read. "Hunting," Lucien said finally. "They'll be back soon." Vera showed me to a room on the second floor, larger and more comfortable than anywhere I'd ever lived. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, covered in furs and warm blankets. A stone fireplace had been lit, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the forest. "Is this mine?" I asked, incredulous. "This is yours," Vera confirmed. "Lucien wants you to be comfortable here." But I struggled with the words. What was I? A servant? A slave? Property? Your pack, Vera said firmly. Whatever else, your pack now. After she left, I unpacked my few belongings, trying to make the space feel less enormous and impersonal. My mother's quilt looked tiny on the huge bed. My books barely filled one shelf of the built-in bookcases. My clothes hung lost in the walk-in closet. But when I placed my parents' wedding photo on the bedside table, something shifted. This wasn't home yet, might never be home, but it was a place where I could remember them, where I could honor their memory. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called. Lucien entered carrying a tray of food, soup that smelled of herbs and winter vegetables, thick bread, tea that steamed in the cold air. He set it on the small table by the window, then stood back, hands clasped behind him. "You must be hungry. The journey was long." I was hungry, I realized. I hadn't eaten since breakfast the day before, too nervous about the auction to manage food. But more than that, I was curious about this man who had bought me, who spoke to me with kindness despite owning me completely. "Thank you," I said. Sitting down at the table, the soup was delicious, rich and warming, with flavors I couldn't quite identify. "This is good. Vera made it. She's an excellent cook." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Nora, I want you to understand something. Yes, I bought you from your Alpha. Yes, there are legal documents that say I own you. But I want you to think of this as employment rather than ownership." I looked up from my soup, studying his face. He seemed sincere, but I'd learned to be wary of promises from Alphas. "Employment suggests I can quit," I said carefully. "Can you? In practical terms, I mean. Where would you go? Your pack sold you. You have no money, no resources, no connections outside of here." It was brutally honest, and I appreciated that more than pretty lies. "No," I admitted. "I can't." "Then let's call it partnership. You help my pack, and we provide for you. Food, shelter, safety, purpose."
Help your pack do what? We're having difficulties. Our traditional food sources have disappeared. We're isolated, too far from other territories to hunt on their lands. We need someone with your skills to help us find solutions." "My skills?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm a record keeper. I file papers and organize supplies. How is that going to help a starving pack?" Lucien stepped closer, his silver eyes intense. "Your pack's records include 3 centuries of oral history, stories about the old ways, the old knowledge, things that have been forgotten by most but preserved by a few." "You want me to research?" I asked, confused. "I want you to remember," he said, "to help us remember what we've lost." Before I could ask what he meant, voices echoed from downstairs, the sound of the front door opening, boots stomping snow from feet, quiet conversation in voices I didn't recognize. The hunting party had returned. "Come," Lucien said, extending his hand. "Meet your new pack." I followed him downstairs, my heart racing. These people, wolves, whatever they were, they would be my life now. My survival depended on their acceptance, their tolerance, their willingness to see me as more than just purchased goods. The great room was no longer empty. A dozen pack members stood around the massive fireplace, steam rising from their snow-covered clothes. They were all beautiful in that ethereal way that Lucien and Vera possessed. Pale skin, light eyes, hair in shades of white and silver and ash brown. They looked like beings from old fairy tales, creatures of winter and legend. They also looked hungry, not just for food, though I could see the lean lines of their bodies, the sharp angles of cheekbones a little too prominent, but hungry in a way that went deeper, desperate, hollow. "Everyone," Lucien said, his voice carrying easily through the room, "I want you to meet Nora. She's joining our pack." The introductions were polite, but subdued. Marcus, the head tracker, Elena, who managed the pack's meter stores, David and Sarah, a mated pair who served as scouts, others whose names I tried to memorize, faces I'd tried to connect to roles in relationships. But it was what they didn't say that spoke loudest, the way their eyes lingered on me, hope and skepticism warring in their expressions, the way they kept glancing at Lucien, as if looking for confirmation of something they didn't quite dare to believe.
Nora's family kept the historical records for Winters Hollow, Lucien explained. She has knowledge of the old ways that might help us. The old ways, repeated Marcus, his voice flat. Like the songs. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Songs. There was something about the way he said it, with a mixture of longing and bitterness that made my skin prickle. What songs? I asked. The pack members exchanged glances, some bitter, some sad, all resigned. The calling songs, Vera said quietly, the ones that brought the herds. I felt my stomach drop. You mean the legend about Omegas who could sing prey to the pack? I looked around at their faces, trying to read the truth there. That's just a story, a metaphor. Is it? Lucien asked. Your great-grandmother was Nora Winters, wasn't she? Of the Moon Song bloodline? How did he know that? Yes, but my grandmother wrote about her, about the songs she sang that filled Winters Hollow with deer and elk and caribou, about the winter when those songs failed and how the herds never returned in the same numbers. I stared at him, understanding beginning to dawn like cold sunlight. You bought me because you think I inherited some magical ability to sing animals to their deaths? The silence that followed was answer enough. That's insane, I said, my voice rising. I can't carry a tune, let alone work magic with my voice. You've wasted your money. Have I? Lucien stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the warm room. When did the herds disappear from Winters Hollow, Nora? When did your pack start struggling, start selling off territory, start making desperate choices? I wanted to deny it, but the truth was written in every year of my life. The gradual decline, the increasing desperation, the slow starvation that had driven Sterling to sell his own pack members. That doesn't prove anything, I said weakly. No, Lucien agreed, but it suggests something. And right now, suggestion is all we have. I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Beautiful, desperate, dying faces. People who had pinned their last hope on a purchased Omega with a family history of folktales and superstition. What if I can't? I whispered. What if the songs are just stories and I'm just a secretary who can't even sing happy birthday without cracking? Then we'll find another way, Lucien said firmly. But first, let's see what you remember. That night, alone in my enormous room, I pulled out my journal and began to write. Everything I could remember about my great-grandmother Moira, about the stories my mother had told me about the old songs and older ways. Moira Winters, born 1923, died 1987. They called her the Moon Singer because she sang best under the full moon, her voice carrying across valleys to where the herds grazed. The deer would come first, then the elk, then the great caribou herds from the far north. They would walk into Winters Hollow as if drawn by invisible threads, and the pack would feast. But those were just stories, weren't they? I tried to remember my mother's voice, the way she'd hum while she cooked, the lullabies she'd sung to chase away my childhood nightmares. Had there been something special about her voice? Something I'd inherited but never recognized? I opened my mouth and tried to sing, just a simple melody. What came out was a cracked, off-key warble that made me wince and stop immediately. If I was supposed to save this pack with my voice, they were all going to die. The next morning, Vera knocked on my door bright and early. Lucien wants to show you something, she said. Dress warmly. I bundled up in every piece of winter clothing I owned and followed her outside. The world beyond the lodge was pristine and breathtaking. Snow-covered forests stretching to the horizon, mountains rising like ancient guardians against a pale blue sky. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but so clean it made me feel more awake than I had in years. Lucien waited by the tree line, dressed in practical winter gear that somehow managed to look elegant on his tall frame. This way, he said, leading us into the forest. We walked for an hour, following paths that were invisible to me but clear as highways to my companions. The silence was profound. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, no sign of life beyond the whisper of wind through pine branches. Listen, Lucien said, stopping in a small clearing. What do you hear?
I closed my eyes and listened. Wind, the creak of tree branches, the soft sound of snow settling on snow. Nothing, I said. I hear nothing.
Exactly. His voice was grim. This forest should be full of life. Deer, elk, moose, smaller game. Instead, it's silent as a graveyard. What happened? 3 winters ago, a blight hit the caribou herds, some kind of disease that spread through their population like wildfire. Within 6 months, they were gone. Not just dead, but gone. No bodies, no remains. As if they simply left. Migrated somewhere else? That's what we thought at first. We sent scouts to other territories, tracked their traditional migration routes. Nothing. It's as if an entire species just vanished from this part of the world. I looked around at the empty forest, trying to imagine it full of life. And the other animals? Followed the caribou. Our ecosystem was built around the great herds. When they disappeared, everything else did too. Lucien's voice was heavy with loss. We've been living on what little small game we can trap, supplemented by supplies we buy from southern packs, but our resources are almost exhausted. How long do you have? Without a successful hunt, maybe 2 months before we start losing pack members to starvation. 2 months. No wonder they were desperate enough to believe in old stories and purchased omegas. We walked deeper into the forest, and Lucien began to tell me about his pack. The Northern Reach had been their territory for over 2 centuries, a harsh but abundant land that had supported a proud and self-sufficient community. They were trackers, hunters, guardians of the wild places. They lived by the old codes, followed the old ways, maintained traditions that other packs had abandoned in favor of modern convenience. We never needed the outside world, he said, never wanted it. The forest provided everything we required. And now? Now we're dying, and all our pride and traditions mean nothing if we can't feed our people. I could hear the pain in his voice, the weight of responsibility he carried. He was an alpha watching his pack slowly starve, and he'd spent $30,000, probably most of their remaining resources, on what might be a fairy tale. Show me the songs. He stopped walking and turned to face me. What? If my great-grandmother really could call the herds, there must be some record of how she did it. Songs have words, melodies, specific forms. Show me what you know. Hope flickered in his silver eyes. My grandmother kept some records, notes, descriptions. I'm not sure how complete they are. It's a place to start. We returned to the lodge, where Lucien led me to a room I hadn't seen before, a library that took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with books both ancient and modern, but it was the collection of handwritten journals that caught my attention. Leather-bound volumes that looked like they'd been lovingly maintained for generations. My family's records, Lucien explained, pulling several journals from a high shelf. My grandmother was meticulous about documenting pack history, especially anything related to the old practices. I opened the first journal with reverent care. The pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear and precise. I found myself looking at detailed observations of pack life from the early 1900s, including several references to the moon singer of Winter's Hollow. Nora Winters visited our territory during the autumn of 1952. I read aloud. Her reputation as a caller preceded her, and Alpha Frost, your grandfather, requested a demonstration of her abilities. At sunset on the 3rd day of her visit, she positioned herself on the high ridge overlooking the eastern valley and began to sing. I looked up at Lucien, who was reading over my shoulder. Your grandmother was very thorough. Keep reading. She kept reading. The song was unlike anything I had ever heard before. Not quite a howl, not quite human music, but something in between. It seemed to resonate in my bones, to vibrate through the earth itself. She sang for perhaps 20 minutes, her voice rising and falling in patterns that felt ancient, primal. At first, nothing happened. Then, as the last light faded from the sky, we heard them, hoofbeats in the distance, growing closer. A herd of elk emerged from the tree line, at least 40 strong, walking calmly toward the sound of Moira's voice. They showed no fear, no wariness. It was as if they had been called by a trusted friend. The hunt that followed was the most successful in our pack's history. The elk seemed almost willing to sacrifice themselves, moving slowly, making no attempt to flee.
Moira explained that the song didn't control the animals, but rather spoke to them in the old language, offering a trade, their lives for the survival of the pack, their deaths for meaning and honor.
I set the journal down, my hands shaking slightly. This is impossible. Is it? Lucien asked quietly. Or is it just something we've forgotten how to do? I turned the pages, finding more entries about my great-grandmother's visit, more detailed descriptions of the calling songs. According to Lucien's grandmother, Moira had spent hours teaching the technique to interested pack members, but none of them had been able to replicate her success. The gift seems to be tied to bloodline, I read. Moira explained that her grandmother had been a caller, as had her grandmother's sister. It runs in families, passed down through the female line, but it skips generations and appears unpredictably. She believes her own daughter may carry the potential, though it hasn't manifested yet. My mother, had she known? Had she carried this ability and never realized it? There are notations about the songs themselves, Lucien said, pointing to a section covered in musical notation. My grandmother tried to transcribe what she remembered. I studied the notes, trying to make sense of the strange markings. The melody was unlike anything I'd seen before. It seemed to flow and shift, with intervals that didn't follow traditional music theory. "Can you read music?" Lucien asked. "A little. My mother tried to teach me piano when I was young, but I was never very good." I traced the notes with my finger, trying to hear the melody in my head. But this doesn't look like any music I've ever seen. "That's because it's not music, in the traditional sense," Vera said from the doorway. I hadn't heard her enter, but she moved like winter wind, silent and sudden. She joined us at the table, her pale fingers tracing the strange notations. My grandmother heard Moira sing once when she was just a child. She said it wasn't like listening to a song, but like overhearing a conversation in a language you almost, but not quite understood. "A conversation with who?" I asked. "With the forest," Lucien said quietly. "With the spirits of the animals. With something larger than all of us." I wanted to scoff at the mysticism, but sitting in this room surrounded by generations of carefully documented history, I found I couldn't dismiss it so easily. These people weren't fools or dreamers. They were practical, pragmatic survivors who had kept meticulous records of everything they had observed.
"There's more," Lucien said, opening another journal. "Descriptions of other callers from different packs, different bloodlines. It wasn't unique to your great-grandmother. It was a widespread ability that seemed to fade over time." I read account after account of women who could sing the herds home, the wolf speaker of the eastern mountains who could call down entire flocks of migrating birds, the bear friend of the northern forests whose voice could summon the great brown bears to share their honey, the deer sister of the southern valleys whose songs filled the meadows with grazing herds. "What happened to them?" I asked. "Why did the ability disappear?" "The same thing that happened to most of the old ways," Vera said sadly. "Modernization, urbanization, young people leaving traditional territories for jobs in cities, bloodlines scattered, knowledge lost, the connection to the wild places severed." "But not completely lost," Lucien added, his eyes intense. "Not if you're here." I closed the journal and looked at these two beautiful, desperate people who had pinned their survival on my untested, probably non-existent abilities. "I can't sing," I said flatly. "I'm tone-deaf. I couldn't carry a tune if my life depended on it." "Your life does depend on it. All our lives do." The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. 12 people, slowly starving, looking to me for salvation I couldn't provide. "I'll try," I whispered, "but I need you to understand, when I fail, and I will fail, you need to have another plan." "Fair enough. But let's see what happens when you don't try to sing like a human." "What do you mean?" "You keep talking about carrying a tune, about traditional singing, but these songs aren't human music. There's something older, something that connects to the wolf in you rather than the person." That afternoon, Lucien led me back into the forest, this time to a high ridge that overlooked the valley where his pack's territory stretched toward the horizon. The view was breathtaking, endless wilderness painted in white and green, mountains rising like frozen waves against the pale sky. This is where my grandmother said Moira stood when she called the elk. If there's any power left in the old ways, it would be strongest here.
I looked out over the empty landscape, trying to imagine it filled with life. Herds of caribou moving like rivers of brown and gold across the snow, elk standing proud against the tree line, deer picking their careful way through the underbrush. "I don't know how to begin," I admitted. "Close your eyes," Lucien said softly. "Don't think about singing, think about calling. Think about reaching out to something that's lost and asking it to come home." I closed my eyes and tried to follow his instructions. The wind was cold against my face, carrying scents of pine and snow and something else, something wild and clean that made my wolf self stir restlessly beneath my human consciousness. I opened my mouth, not to sing, but to... what? Call? Speak? I wasn't sure. What emerged was barely a whisper, more breath than voice, a sound that seemed to be pulled from somewhere deep in my chest. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. "Try again," Lucien encouraged. "Don't force it, let it come naturally." I tried again, this time allowing the sound to rise from deeper within me, from the place where my wolf nature lived. It was still barely audible, still nothing like the powerful calling songs described in the journals, but there was something different about it, something that felt less human, more other. We stood there for an hour, me making quiet, tentative sounds, while Lucien offered encouragement and the empty forest remained stubbornly empty. Finally, as the sun began to set, I gave up. "This is useless," I said, frustration making my voice sharp. "I'm not my great-grandmother. I don't have her gift, whatever it was." "It was your first attempt," Lucien said reasonably. "These things take time to develop. Time you don't have." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over his dying territory. "No," he agreed, finally. "We don't." That night, I dreamed of my great-grandmother. In the dream, she was young and beautiful, standing on a moonlit ridge with her arms spread wide and her voice raised in song. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, seeming to weave itself through the fabric of the world, calling to something vast and ancient and wild. Animals emerged from the forest as she sang, not just deer and elk, but creatures I'd never seen before. Wolves the size of bears, their eyes glowing like stars. Great cats with fur like liquid shadow. Birds with wingspans that blocked out the moon. They came to her call willingly, joyfully, as if they had been waiting their entire lives to hear her voice. And when the song ended, she looked directly at me across the decades and smiled. "The song isn't in your throat, little one," she said in a voice like silver bells. "It's in your heart. Stop trying to sing like a human and learn to speak like the earth." I woke with tears on my cheeks and the echo of her voice in my ears. The next day, I asked Vera to show me around the pack's living areas. I needed to understand who I was trying to save, to put faces and stories to the lives that depended on my success. The lodge was larger than I'd initially realized, with multiple wings housing different families and purposes. There was David and Sarah, the mated pair who served as scouts, sharing a cozy apartment filled with maps and tracking equipment. Marcus, the head tracker, lived alone in a sparse room that spoke of a man who spent most of his time in the forests. Elena, who managed their stores, had a space that was part office, part pantry, organized with military precision. But it was the children's wing that broke my heart. 3 small bedrooms, empty now, their tiny beds made with careful precision, toys arranged neatly on shelves, clothes folded in drawers that hadn't been opened in months. "Where are the children?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Sent south to Allied packs," Vera said, quietly. When it became clear we couldn't feed them, Lucien made the hardest decision of his life. He gave them away to keep them alive. I sank onto one of the small beds, imagining the scene. Children torn from their parents, from everything they'd ever known because their pack was dying. The pain Lucien must have felt, the guilt that probably ate at him every day. How many? 7, ages 3 to 12. Vera's voice was steady, but I could see the grief in her pale eyes. The youngest barely understood what was happening. The oldest, she begged us not to send her away, said she'd rather starve with her family than live with strangers. "But you sent her anyway,"
We sent her anyway, because sometimes love means letting go, even when it destroys you.
I thought about my own parents, how they'd fought so hard to give me a good life even as their own health failed, how they'd made sure I had skills and education and everything they could provide before the car accident took them away. Love as sacrifice, love as survival. I have to succeed, I said, more to myself than to Vera. You will, she said firmly, because failure isn't an option, not when it means losing everything we've ever loved. That evening, I returned to the ridge alone. Lucien had offered to accompany me, but I needed to try this without the pressure of an audience. If I was going to make a fool of myself howling at the empty forest, I preferred to do it in private. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. I stood where Moira had once stood, trying to feel some connection to her, to the gift she'd supposedly passed down through our bloodline. This time, instead of trying to sing, I simply spoke. I don't know if anyone's listening, I said to the wind. I don't know if this is real or if I'm just a desperate woman talking to herself on a mountain. But if there's anything out there, if there's any truth to the old stories, I need help. My voice was small in the vastness, but it felt more natural than my previous attempts at sinning. There are people depending on me, good people, people who've lost everything and are hanging on to hope by their fingernails. I don't know how to be what they need me to be, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to try. I paused, listening to the silence that followed my words. Nothing, just wind and the distant call of a lone bird. But as I turned to go, something made me stop. A sound so faint I might have imagined it, hoofbeats in the distance. I held my breath, straining to listen, but heard only the wind in the trees. Wishful thinking, nothing more. Still, I returned to the ridge the next day, and the day after that. Each time I spoke to the empty forest, sharing my fears and hopes and desperate prayers. Sometimes I tried to reproduce the melody from Lucien's grandmother's notation, usually with disastrous results. More often, I just talked, treating the vast wilderness like a friend who might understand. A week passed, then two. The pack members began to look at me with expressions that shifted from hope to disappointment to resignation. I was failing them, as I'd predicted I would. The purchased Omega with no magic in her voice, no connection to the old ways, no ability to save anyone. Lucien never said anything directly, but I could see the strain in his silver eyes, the weight of responsibility that grew heavier with each passing day. He was watching his pack slowly die, and the solution he'd invested everything in was proving to be worthless. I began to avoid meals, unable to bear the sight of carefully rationed portions being shared among people who needed so much more. I spent most of my time in the library, reading every account of the calling songs, searching for some clue I might have missed. That's when I found the reference to the ice caves. It was buried in a journal from the 1940s, a casual mention of sacred spaces where the old songs were practiced and preserved. According to the notes, there were several caves in the northern territories where the acoustics were perfect for the calling songs, where generations of singers had gone to train and to commune with the spirits of the animals. Natural amplifiers, the journal called them. Places where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world grows thin. I brought the journal to Lucien, hope flickering in my chest like a fragile flame. "Do you know about these caves?" I asked. He studied the passage I'd marked, his expression thoughtful. "There are ice caves throughout this territory. Some of them have unusual properties, strange acoustics, odd formations. My grandmother always said they were sacred spaces. Could you take me to one?" "It's dangerous. The caves are unstable, the ice formations can shift without warning, and in this cold, you could freeze to death in minutes if something went wrong." "I'll freeze to death anyway when your pack starves and can't keep the lodge heated. This might be our only chance." He considered this for a long moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow, we'll need proper equipment, extra supplies, and Vera comes with us." "Deal." The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. We set out before sunrise, loaded with climbing gear, thermal equipment, and enough supplies for several days. The cave Lucien had chosen was half a day's hike into the deep wilderness, accessible only by paths that existed more in memory than in reality.
The journey was harder than anything I'd ever attempted. The snow was knee-deep in some places, the terrain treacherous with hidden rocks and sudden drops. My lungs burned in the thin air, and even with all my layers, the cold seemed to seep into my bones. But it was also beautiful. The kind of wild, pristine beauty that reminded you how small and temporary humans were in the grand scheme of things. Ancient forests that had never heard the sound of machinery, mountains that had stood unchanged since the Ice Age, skies so blue and clear it hurt to look at directly. "There," Lucien said, pointing toward what looked like a crack in the mountainside, "the Cave of Echoes." As we drew closer, I could see that the opening was larger than it had appeared from a distance, tall enough for a person to walk through upright, wide enough for several people to enter side by side. Ice formations framed the entrance like a natural cathedral, and the dark opening seemed to exhale cold air that was even more bitter than the mountain wind. "The acoustics in there are incredible," Vera said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Sounds carry for hundreds of yards, and the ice formations create natural amplification. If the calling songs work anywhere, they'll work here." We made our way carefully into the cave, our headlamps throwing wild shadows on the ice-covered walls. The space opened up almost immediately into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness above us. Ice formations created natural pillars and arches, turning the cave into something that looked like a frozen palace. But it was the acoustics that took my breath away. Every footstep, every whisper seemed to be caught and amplified, echoing through the chamber in ways that made it impossible to tell where the original sound ended and the echo began. "Try something," Lucien suggested, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I cleared my throat, a sound that bounced around the cave like a gunshot. Then, hesitantly, I began to speak. "Hello," I said, and the word came back to me transformed, layered with harmonics I'd never heard before. It was as if the cave itself was singing along with my voice, adding depths and overtones that made even that simple word sound musical. "My God," I whispered, and the whisper became a chorus. I tried humming, just a simple melody, and the cave took the sound and wove it into something complex and beautiful. Every note I produced was answered by a dozen echoes, each slightly different, creating harmonies that seemed to have a life of their own.
"This is it," I said, and the words rang through the chamber like a bell. "This is where I need to be." We set up camp in the outer chamber, close enough to the entrance to be safe, but far enough inside to be protected from the wind. As night fell, I made my way deeper into the cave, to a natural platform of ice that seemed designed for exactly what I was attempting. I stood there in the darkness, surrounded by ice and stone and silence, and tried to remember my great-grandmother's voice from my dream. Not the words she'd spoken, but the feeling of her song, the way it had seemed to reach out into the world and call to something wild and ancient. I opened my mouth and let sound emerge, not singing, not speaking, but something in between, a call that came from deep in my chest, from the place where my wolf nature lived. The cave caught the sound and transformed it, turning my tentative call into something powerful and haunting. I could hear layers in my own voice that I'd never known were there, harmonies that seemed to reveal the true nature of what I was trying to do. I called again, this time with more confidence, letting the sound rise and fall in patterns that felt natural, intuitive. The cave amplified and enhanced every note, creating a song that was more than the sum of its parts. And then I heard it, an answer, faint at first, so soft I thought I might be imagining it. But there it was again, a distant sound that might have been wind through the trees or might have been something else entirely. Hoofbeats, growing closer. I kept calling, my voice gaining strength and confidence with each note. The cave turned my calls into a symphony, a complex weaving of sound that seemed to reach out beyond the physical world into some realm where communication was possible between species, between the human and the wild. The hoofbeats grew louder, more distinct. Not just one animal, but many, a herd moving through the forest with purpose and direction. My heart pounded with excitement and terror. This was working. This was actually working.
I called until my voice was raw, until the sound seemed to be coming from my entire body rather than just my throat. The cave amplified every note, sending my song out into the world like a beacon. When I finally stopped, the silence was profound. But it wasn't empty. It was full of potential, of connection, of something that had been broken finally beginning to heal. I made my way back to our camp, my legs shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Well?" Lucien asked, studying my face in the firelight. I paused, not wanting to promise something I couldn't deliver. I think something heard me. We spent 3 days in the cave, and each day I felt the connection growing stronger. My voice, amplified and enhanced by the natural acoustics, began to find its true range and power. The cave taught me things about sound and rhythm that no human teacher could have explained. How to layer calls on top of each other. How to create harmonies with my own echoes. How to let the song flow through me rather than trying to control it. More importantly, I began to understand what the calling songs actually were. They weren't magic, not in the fantasy novel sense. They were communication, a complex language that spoke to something deep in animal consciousness, something that predated human civilization and had been all but forgotten in our modern world. The songs didn't control the animals or force them to sacrifice themselves. Instead, they created a dialogue, a negotiation between predator and prey that honored both the hunter's need and the prey's dignity. They reminded the herds of their place in the natural cycle, of the ancient contract between wolf and caribou, predator and prey, life and death. On our 3rd night in the cave, I dreamed again of my great-grandmother. This time, she didn't speak. Instead, she simply stood beside me as I called into the darkness, her presence a warm comfort in the cold cave. When I woke, I found myself humming a melody I'd never heard before, one that seemed to flow from some deep genetic memory. "It's time," I told Lucien and Vera over our meager breakfast. "I'm ready to try." We packed up our camp and made the difficult journey back to the lodge. But instead of stopping there, I asked Lucien to take me to the high ridge where I'd made my first attempts. This time, I would call from the traditional place, but with everything I'd learned in the cave. The sun was setting as we reached the ridge, painting the snow-covered landscape in familiar shades of gold and rose. I stood in the spot where Moira had once stood, feeling the connection to her more strongly than ever before. But this time, I wasn't alone. The entire pack had come, 12 people whose lives depended on what happened in the next few minutes. They stood behind me, silent and hopeful and terrified, watching their purchased salvation attempt the impossible. I closed my eyes and let my awareness expand. I could feel the forest around me, vast and empty but not quite lifeless. Something was out there, something that had been waiting for the right call, the right invitation to come home.
I opened my mouth and began to sing. The melody that emerged was unlike anything I'd ever produced before. Rich and complex, layered with harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. My voice soared and dipped, following patterns that felt ancient and eternal, calling out into the wilderness with all the longing and love and desperation I carried. I sang of hunger, both mine and theirs. I sang of the ancient contract between wolf and prey, of the honor in sacrifice, of the beauty in the cycle of life and death. I sang of Lucien's children sent away to survive, of pack members rationing their last supplies, of a territory slowly dying for lack of the herds that had sustained it for centuries. And I sang of hope, of the possibility of renewal, of healing, of life returning to places that had known only death. The song poured out of me for what felt like hours. My voice never cracked, never faltered, as if the cave had permanently changed something fundamental about how I produced sound. The melody wove itself through the cold air, carried by the wind across valleys and forests, calling to something that had been lost. When I finally fell silent, the quiet that followed was profound. We stood there, 12 desperate people on a ridge, listening to the echo of the last note fade into nothing. Then, we heard them. Hoofbeats in the distance, growing closer,
Not the scattered movement of a few desperate animals, but the steady, purposeful sound of a herd on the move. They emerged from the tree line like a vision from another age. Caribou, dozens of them, their antlers catching the last light of the setting sun. They moved without fear, without wariness, walking steadily toward the sound of my voice. Behind them came more. Elk, their massive forms ghostly in the twilight. Deer picking their way carefully through the snow. And behind them, barely visible at the edge of vision, other shapes. Larger animals, creatures I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. The pack members around me gasped and whispered, but I barely heard them. I was transfixed by the sight of the returning herds, by the knowledge that my voice had somehow called them back from whatever far country they'd been lost in. The caribou approached without fear, stopping just a few yards from where we stood. Their leader, a magnificent bull with antlers that seemed to span the sky, looked directly at me with eyes that held ancient wisdom. And I understood. This wasn't about domination or magic. It was about respect, about acknowledgement, about the ancient agreement between predator and prey that made survival possible for both. The herds had returned not because I'd controlled them, but because I'd reminded them of their place in the great cycle, of their honor in the dance of life and death.
The hunt that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. There was no chase, no fear, no desperate flight. Instead, there was a kind of ceremony, a ritual acknowledgement of what was necessary. The animals that gave their lives did so with dignity, their sacrifice honored by hunters who understood the weight of what they were taking. When it was over, when the pack's meat stores were full for the first time in 3 winters, I found myself sitting on a ridge where it had all begun, looking out over a forest that was no longer empty. The herds had returned, and they would stay as long as the songs continued, as long as the old agreements were honored. Lucien found me there as the stars began to emerge in the clear sky. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me yet," I replied. "This was just the beginning. The songs need to be sung regularly, the connection maintained, and I need to train others in case something happens to me." "Others? Your bloodline carries the potential too," I said, remembering something from the journals. "The ability runs in families, passed through different lines. With practice, with the right training, some of your pack members could learn this." Hope flickered in his silver eyes. "You'd teach them?" "I'd try. But first," I stood up, brushing snow from my clothes. "First, you need to bring your children home." His face transformed, the careful alpha mask falling away to reveal the pain and longing underneath. "You think it's safe now?" "I think a pack that can call the herds home can feed 7 children. I think those children belong here, with their families, learning the old ways so they can preserve them for the next generation." That night, as the pack celebrated their first real feast in years, Lucien approached me with something in his hands. It was the silver chain, the symbol of my purchased status, but it had been transformed, melted down and reforged into something new, a slender ring that caught the firelight like captured starshine. "You were bought once," he said, echoing words from the original story. "You will never be sold again. Wear this as the echo of a wound closed." I slipped the ring onto my finger, feeling its weight, not heavy but substantial, a reminder of how I'd come to this place, but also a symbol of how I'd transformed my circumstances into something meaningful. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you help us rebuild," he said. "Help us remember what we'd forgotten. Help us teach our children the old songs so they're never lost again." I pressed my forehead to his, a gesture that felt natural and right. Around us, the pack celebrated, their voices raised in joy and thanksgiving. Outside, the forests rang with the sounds of returning life, the calls of night birds, the rustle of small animals, the distant hoofbeats of herds that had come home. I opened my mouth and sang, not the calling song, but something else, a song of belonging, of found family, of love that grew from the most unlikely soil.
My voice was still not beautiful in any traditional sense, still cracked and imperfect and thoroughly human. But the valley answered anyway, with hoofbeats and bird calls and the whisper of wind through pine branches. Love, it turned out, was simply learning which songs were already waiting for your voice. And in that moment, surrounded by my new pack, with the ring on my finger and the taste of hope in the air, I finally understood what it meant to be home. The months that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding. The children returned, their faces bright with joy at being reunited with their families. The pack's numbers grew as distant relatives, hearing stories of the restored territory, came home to claim their place in the renewed community. I established a schedule of calling songs, learning through trial and error how often they needed to be sung to maintain the herd's presence. Every few days, I would climb to the ridge and send my voice out into the wilderness, renewing the ancient contracts, keeping the dialogue alive between the human world and the wild. More importantly, I began training others. Vera showed remarkable aptitude, her voice finding harmonies in the cave that even I couldn't achieve. Two of the younger pack members, both from bloodlines with connections to the old ways, began to develop their own calling abilities. The songs evolved too. What had started as desperate attempts to recreate ancient practices became something new, something that belonged to our time and our pack specifically. We developed variations for different seasons, different animals, different needs. The old ways, preserved but not fossilized, living and growing as they were meant to.
But the most important change was in me. I was no longer the purchased Omega, the desperate last resort of a dying pack. I was a valued member of a thriving community, a keeper of ancient knowledge, a bridge between the old world and the new. And I was loved, not as property, not as a useful tool, but as family, as pack, as someone who belonged exactly where she was. Standing on the ridge one evening, 6 months after that first successful calling, I watched the herds move across the valley below like living rivers of gold and brown. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in familiar shades of twilight, and the air carried the sounds of a forest fully alive. Lucien joined me, as he often did, his presence warm and solid beside me. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the loss of my old life, the small cabin and familiar routines of Winter's Hollow? Did I mourn the person I'd been before that terrible night, when I'd been sold like livestock? "No," I said finally. "I was dying there, just as slowly as your pack was dying here. I just didn't know it yet." He nodded, understanding. "And now?" Now I was alive in ways I'd never known were possible. Now I had purpose, family, a voice that could literally call life back to dying places. Now I had love that had grown from the strangest beginnings into something strong and real and lasting. "Now I'm home," I said, and opened my mouth to sing. The song that emerged was new, a melody I'd never attempted before. It spoke of gratitude, of belonging, of the miracle of finding your place in the world when you'd thought you were lost forever. It rose into the twilight air, carried by the wind across valleys and forests, calling to the wild things that this territory was protected, that the old agreements were honored, and that the ancient songs would continue as long as there were voices to sing them. And the valley answered, as it always did, with the sound of life returning home.
Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this story. Please drop your thoughts in the comments section below. I love hearing from you. If you enjoyed this, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you'd never miss any new content. And if you know someone who'd love this story, please share it with them. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you in the next one.